Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the As a Woman podcast, an initiative of Yebetumi. We are still on our solidarity against sexual and gender-based violence season. We've been talking about violence against women in the different demographics. Today, we are talking about violence against queer women. It's a heavy topic. There's a lot to digest. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to take in. And so to do this with me, I have Dr. Rita Nketiah. She's a feminist activist and a research consultant. She's not a medical doctor. She's a PhD holder. There's a lot of conversation happening about PhD, women who are PhD holders. And so I find it important to mention that she's a PhD holder. She's a very educated woman. And she's thankfully a feminist activist. Thank you, Rita, and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Michaella Gyatsen. She is also a feminist activist and a co-director at Drama Queens. Drama Queens is a Pan-African feminist organization that does a lot of organizing around queer rights and women's rights. Welcome, Michaella. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It is, and I'm really happy to see the both of you. Is there anything you would like to say about yourselves or about your work before we get into the details of the discussions?
I think you captured it. I am a feminist activist based here in Accra. And I work at the intersection of women's rights work, feminist work, and LGBT activism. I also work across academia as well as philanthropy.
Thank you, Rita. Michaella.
So my name is Michaella. I'd like to introduce myself somehow. It's very affirming to say my own name. A lot of the work that I do in women's organizing is centered around making resources available for other people to be able to find themselves, find their niches, and then to learn around them, but also unlearn and relearn. A huge part of my work and the work that we do at Drama Queens is to create safe spaces where people can express themselves freely of all of the biases and misconceptions that occur and exist within mainstream media and just mainstream organizing and spaces, right? So then that's where Drama Queens and myself, we come in, creating that extra niche where women and other gender minorities can just sit, exist freely, but then also say what's in their head, how it is without fear.
Yeah. Thank you, Michaella. That's insightful. Before, a lot of people became more familiar with queer rights and really got into the conversations properly when the anti-LGBTQI bill was introduced. But before then, we know that a lot had been happening. There's been a lot of discrimination. There's been a lot of verbal and physical abuse against queer people in Ghana. And a lot of the time when we talk about queer rights, it's always centered on gay men. Gay men. One Love says this thing that, I know it's not palatable for a discussion like this, but I'm going to say, he's trumu. And he's right. That's what a lot of people think about. We forget about queer women in the equation. When we talk about queer women, it's always about, corrective rape. That's what a lot of the men are always talking about. Yeah, this one, we can, do this to her to straighten her up, to get her to be heterosexual. And that's usually where the conversation begins and ends, where queer women are concerned. And so today, I want us to, our focus is queer women, and we are biased, and we are happily biased because this is what we do. And I've already mentioned how homophobic our society is. Let me calm down. For you, as people who work in the space, who work with queer people, queer women specifically, how homophobic have you seen or witnessed our society being, and how does it impact queer women?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Well, I think we can now see, from this bill, how homophobic Ghanaian society actually is, right? I think a few years ago, if you had asked me this question, I would have said, yes, we're quite conservative, we're very religious, but I didn't think that we would get to the point where we would be legislating this kind of hate against queer people. And I think that it's unfortunate that several forces, including the church institutions, including our politicians, some traditional leaders, some learned people have come together to create this bill that targets the community. But I think, of course, many of us first experience homophobia in our families, right?
Yeah.
We are socialized to be heterosexual and heteronormative. Many young girls are being raised to eventually become some man's wife, right? Yeah. That's how we're socialized. And so for many of us, when we do come out, we face a lot of discrimination, even within our own family context, right? And I'll just say that we know that African women and girls' sexuality is heavily policed.
Yeah.
Straight, queer, bisexual, what have you, whatever it is, our sexuality as African women is constantly policed since we're kids, right? And I think some of the impact of that homophobia is... I think on one hand, we see that a lot of young women are dependent on their families, right, financially. And so when you come out, there's the risk that your family will no longer support you. They'll deny you financial support. You may even be thrown out of your own home, right? You may be forced into marriages, right? Yeah. And you may, experience corrective rape, as you mentioned earlier, right? And so we see the impact of homophobia on our lives and on our relationship with our families and our communities. And then for some of us who are maybe more masculine presenting, who don't present in the traditional feminine way, in public space, you see the harassment that, we experience, right? And so, the consequences of homophobia are far reaching. And now we see that the bill is making it even more difficult for us to exist, right? Yeah. Because it means that, for example, if you do get sacked from your home for identifying as queer, if you now go and try and rent, your own place somewhere, right? The bill has clauses in it that actually force landlords to report you, right? Yeah. Accessing healthcare is already a difficult thing for a lot of young women, and now, healthcare service providers have a duty to report, right? So there are lots of consequences for both the sort of social homophobia as well as this legislation of homophobia.
It doesn't get any homophobic than having a legislative instrument that criminalizes being queer. Unfortunate. Michaella?
That's like a very good sentence for me to start on, because what this bill does is that it sanctions social prejudice and social violence. Yeah. And that's something that women just generally are at the brunt of all the time. When you started, you're asking why it seems like whenever the conversations of queer rights and queer liberation comes up, women don't get mentioned as much. That's like directly proportional to the fact that women just don't get mentioned. In business and finance, everywhere that people exist, somehow women don't get mentioned or recognized as much. So unfortunately, even when we're talking about these things, they still don't get mentioned as much, but then they see some of the worst perversions of the violence that queer people generally face. There is a lot of direct correlations to just how women are treated generally and the kind of access that women have generally, because again, like Dr. Rita was saying, if you're outside and you have to leave your house and you have to rent, before it even comes up that you're a queer person, or that before even the landlord is going to invoke all the statutes of duty to report or not renting to queer women or anything at all, there's going to be people questioning why you are renting in the first place. Why, as a young woman, you're not married, why you don't have children. They're going to deny you that thing in the first place. Even in medical places, when you're going through a lot of health conditions could be easily solved, but then medical biases and medical negligence on the basis of gender mean that people don't get the health services that they need. And this is further compounded for queer women. It's further compounded for queer women that do not fit the stereotype, the gender and social stereotypes that society expects us to fit into. And because we are Ghanaian and because we live in Ghanaian society, these gender stereotypes are very gendered and they are very set in some of the rules. Just like, you just think about it, it's like, it doesn't make sense, right? But then they are not just conversational rules, or they're not just conversational topics. They are things that affect people's lives on a very day-to-day basis. And because a lot of them are conversational and a lot of them seem like just conversation topics or seem like just jokes, we don't realize how pervasive the violence against queer women can be. People say things like, you just need to get married. It's a phase. They do not, because they don't, it's basically that. It's a bit difficult to wrap your head around, but it really isn't that difficult. So once you're able to recognize how just generally against, like they're against us, right? How, if you're able to recognize just how much people in the society that we live in is against the women generally, then you're also able to pick out or identify the instances of violence against queer women, which without noticing the general attitude and general perceptions and conceptions of gendered roles and gender roles sanctioned violence, it flies under the radar very easily.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Before I ask my next question, I want to play a video that I came across on TikTok, and I saved it purposely for this discussion. I watched the video, and I just kept asking myself, how can you be this hateful towards people who you don't even know? And I'm going to play it now. Let me.
Like a lot of lesbian, na mumpe so bia beka wasema. Eya mo mfa mechire because so bit same is meka. Di, we aboa papa. Aboa woni ketrema, ene be me ne wato yam. Owi akofu wato obusu afie chi. We akwasea.
This is somebody who doesn't even know. So there is a lesbian couple who got married, and they made a video, and one of them was telling the other that, if I had to choose between you and my family, I would choose you. So it's just a couple professing their love to each other. And this person made this video just insulting them. There's another one.
I am a man can claim a female fool. But I couldn't was a bear. The names are Bosoba. When you say Rita, a boy or Papa is a heavy document. I am men new crew and crew said, someone a day show, and more. For my giant to some, and more for my unpebble.
I'll just end it here. It gets worse. And this is also a reaction to a stud and his girlfriend just kissing. And this person, and she doesn't know them. She just saw the video online and she decided to go all out insulting them, like being verbally abusive like this. We know this bill didn't just come out of, thin air. It didn't just spring up. It's fueled by already existing homophobia. So my question is, how did we get here? How are people so homophobic to the extent that strangers would be this abusive towards people on the internet just because they are queer, and would go to the extent of having a bill that criminalizes queer people?
That's a good question. And I think there are many ways, there are many routes to how we got here. I think that there's actually quite a lot of discrimination in Ghanaian society. Gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, class discrimination, all of those things. Disability, so many, right? They all exist in Ghana, right? And I don't think we've been attentive to it in the way that we need to be. And I'll just say about this clip, because I'm still reacting to it. When I listen to this clip, I just think, okay, well, yeah, we need to talk about patriarchy. We need to talk about internalized misogyny, right?
Definitely.
And why are women so violent towards other women, right? What have we learned about the status of women, the position of women in society, the value of women in society, right? Where we feel that we can say these kinds of things to other women, right? So that's a conversation that I think we need to have. If we think about the the sort of transnational network of anti-rights actors that have, we've seen over the past couple of decades that have been making their way into Africa. You have these, white American evangelical organizations who've lost the war at home and have decided to bring it to Africa as a way to gain power and influence, right? And so they've been behind many of these bills that we've seen in Uganda, we now see in Ghana. And so and they have a lot of money. They have a lot of resources to push these bills, right? I think that there is this sort of like scapegoating of queer communities, as the ills of Ghanaian society, right? And so there's a link that's being made, or a narrative that's being created, that Ghana's national development is tied to, a sort of to the family, right? To the heteronormative man, woman, and child family, right? That union is that unit is sort of is the bedrock of our society and of our development, right? There's a strong narrative around that. And then I think there's also a powerlessness that a lot of Ghanaians feel. So we know that our politicians generally do not make laws that are in our best interests, right? And we often feel powerless to whatever they decide that they want to do, right? And not just the politicians. We know that the church has been very instrumental in getting this bill pushed. And many Ghanaians, Christians, Muslims do not feel like they can really challenge their religious leaders, right?
That's one of our biggest problems.
It's one of our biggest issues, right? That people are not reading the Bible and the Quran for themselves, first of all, right? They're waiting for their leaders to tell them what the Bible says, right? To interpret it for them. And we're not encouraged to think critically or to challenge the status quo, right? And so you have a combination of all of these different factors that have created this moment where we have this bill in front of us, right? I mean, even if you look at how our president has responded to this bill, right? There's just a lack of a political will to come out clearly and say, I do not support this bill, right? So if the head of state, if the head of this country cannot come out and defend his position clearly, how can the average Ghanaian, what power does the average Ghanaian feel they have to be able to say, this bill doesn't make sense? Maybe I don't necessarily support LGBT rights, but why are we spending so much time, money, resources, energy, airtime on this bill when there's so many issues happening right now in Ghana,
And I feel his lack of political will and silence enables abuses. It's like Michaella says, it's signs of abuse against queer people, especially queer women. And you're a leader, Mr. President, lead. Sorry to spring this up on you, Michaella. We are talking about, societal attitudes. A lot of the argument against queerness has been that it's not in our culture. And the title of the bill says it's all proper family and something value. So basically saying that everything queer is contradictory of our values as African people, as Ghanaian people. What would you say to that?
I literally rolled my eyes like that.
I know.
I don't know. I don't know what I suppose what I say to that is that is false. That is laughable. Okay. So
they're
that
having
is
a
false. Giggle. That is laughable. That just doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense because people have existed in Ghana, in these regions for a very long time. And by existing as human beings, there's going to be diversity. Just like on my way here, I was just thinking, because I was passing through like the Labadi township and I grew up in Labadi. And I was just thinking of how when I was younger, like we knew neighbors that had same-sex partners, like that had literally families, same-sex families, based families. And it was okay. It wasn't. So then how does it become something that isn't ours and foreign? And that doesn't make any sense. And even though there's like a new question my mind is still on the first set and it's still pretty much connected because a lot of that question was like, how did we get to this point? And one of the ways, because it's like Rita was saying, there's a lot of different things. It's about power and whoever controls how the story is written has power, but also gets to consolidate even more power. So if you can convince enough people that something is foreign to them, that in itself is a consolidation of power. But that also transfers even more power to you because you're debasing another group of people of their power. And a lot of these arguments are based on language. And that's one thing that we can admit, that language English is a colonial tool and it's not. But then that is ignorant and deliberately misleading to use one angle of a thing to like make a whole different thing. Like it's just that it's not the case, right? Because even if you want to use language, then that is actually evidence the fact that queer people have existed since. It's evidence the fact that gender diverse people have existed in Ghanaian society and within our separate and very, very different ethnic systems for a very long time. Because the language for gender diverse people, the language for people that do not exist within gender binaries, the language for people that have same-sex relationships and same-sex attractions have always existed. Aside language, there's stories. And someone will say, we are talking about history, we are talking about story. But then again, you should recognize the fact that we live in a colonial system that is about power. And this power is connected to like who writes our history. And the fact that Ghanaian history and Ghanaian stories are not always written. It doesn't mean they've not existed. It doesn't mean they are not there or they are not valid. So last in summary, the question, what do I say to that? That it's I was going to say that it's ignorant. Let's go with the word ignorant. That's ignorant, and that it's not true, and that there's a lot of evidence to the otherwise.
Thank you. Rita, would you like to add to that?
No, I think it's well said.
Yeah, I agree. So queer people, gender diverse people have been with us from time immemorial. Before colonialism, they've always been here. You are saying it's not in our culture because you don't even know much of your culture, that you are so, all in arms trying to protect. And we pick and choose what's our culture and what's not. We say, this is, our religion is against queerness, but your religion is against fornication and you're fornicating. So make it make sense.
I'm coming. Just want to like very categorically say that if anything at all is outside of our culture, then it is homophobia. And whenever the conversation of sanctioning homophobia and sanctioning violence against queer people comes up, we like to so quickly refer to that, it's in the constitution, it's not. What is in the constitution is a clear colonial import, right? Like, I just want us to remember that when we got up and said we do constitution, we didn't sit down and think for ourselves what should be our constitution. We took other people's constitutions. We took policies that was within colonization. As in, like, when they came to colonize us and take our lands and steal our father's houses and things, those were the rules they used. And we just like put them in a different book. So then, Can
I also add? I think the culture argument is very interesting, right? So on one hand, as has been pointed out, like, do we actually know our culture, right? You know, when we say Ghanaian culture, we were a colony, right? We were a colony. So, you know, I think we need to start unpacking what is Ghanaian culture actually when we talk about it. Absolutely. But also, I think on the flip side, I mean, culture also adapts and changes and evolves. We can decide.
There's a popular saying that culture is dynamic.
It's dynamic. We get to decide what we keep, you know, and what we let go of, right? Yeah. And I believe, as a human rights activist, as somebody who cares about feminist issues, I think that it's okay for us to say that, like, violence against human beings just because of who they are does not need to be part of our culture moving forward.
Absolutely.
We can let that go, right? We can let it go. So I think the argument that we have to stick to our culture, it doesn't necessarily help us, right? We can evolve and change as people and as a society.
And it's 2024, evolve. Let's get to the last bit of our conversation and we can wrap up. What does an ideal society look like for queer women? And how do we achieve this? It's heavy, I know. I
wouldn't say it's heavy, as in it's okay, I guess it's heavy. It makes you think and dream. And that's
Yeah.
very important. Like I like to say that one of the first rules, or one of the important things that activists or feminists should do is to dream. Like
Yeah.
full stop. Like be as idealistic as you want to be. Dream. But then what would an ideal world for queer people look like for me? It's just like an ideal world for everybody where we can all just live
Yeah.
and exist and choose whether we want to start families or not, but also choose how we want to start the families, but then to also have access to things. Because this is a huge part of how we got to this point. Ghana is in shambles. And an ideal world would mean that the place wasn't in shambles, that we could go to school. We didn't need to pay so much money for subpar education, that when we did go to school, we don't get to be kicked out because we want to wear shorts instead of skirts. That when I don't feel well, I am not afraid to go to the hospital, and that when I do go to the hospital, I'm going to get the care and attention that I need. So the ideal world for queer people, queer women, for me, is one that has access, and one that has a freedom of choice, but also has the freedom to exist.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just to add, I think liberation, right? It's a liberated Ghana. It's a liberated world that we're looking for. You know, one where we don't feel like we have to hide who we are. You know, that we don't have to live in the closets. That we can, as Michaella mentioned, that we can build the families that we want to. That we can live in the communities that we want to. That we can love who we want. Right? I think, and of course, I understand that queer women's freedom and liberation is tied to everybody else's liberation too, right? We want everybody to be free.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the world we're looking for, a world in which there is complete liberation, complete autonomy, and access to justice.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michaella and Rita. And I would just, just to build on what you said, no one is free until we are all free. And for me, that's how I'm going to sign off. I don't know if you have any last words.
That's a good sign off point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll sign off on that. No one is free until we are all free. And queer women have a right to exist in dignity. I've been saying the word dignity a lot lately, but everyone has a right to exist in dignity and in freedom. And like Rita said, liberation. This is where we drop the curtain for today's episode. We've been talking about violence against queer women. We've spoken about the fact that queer women have existed, queer people generally have existed with us for the longest time. Your religious values do not have to impact other people's choice of life, sexuality, or whatever they choose to do. Culture is dynamic. We can evolve. We can change. We can decide that violence against any person isn't part of our culture. And like Michaella said, if anything is uncultural, it is homophobia. See you again next time. You've been listening to the As a Woman podcast, a Yebetumi Initiative, and this season is on solidarity against sexual and gender-based violence. We're out.